Who are the surprise teams of 2024? Which teams can come from completely out of left field, blow their win total out of the water, make an appearance in the college football playoff for the first time in school history, and compete in the college football playoff and potentially win their first college football playoff game along with their first appearance? This can be done and has been done before. TCU did this in 2022. And very early in the season, they came out and shocked everyone, destroying Oklahoma 55-24. And then they beat Kansas and Oklahoma State and Kansas State. They went on the road and beat Texas in a more dominant performance than the one that Alabama put on Texas early in the season. A Bryce Young-led Alabama team, an Alabama team that had the most talented roster in the country by recruiting rankings, and TCU did not even have a top 25 talent roster. TCU was a trailblazer, a surprise team, and even though they lost to Georgia 65-7, because of their 51-45 huge upset over Michigan in the Fiesta Bowl, they will not and should not be looked upon in hindsight as an undeserving team. TCU returned a plethora of starters from 2021, tons of returning production, and they had a great coaching staff. A Broyles Award-winning offensive coordinator in Garrett Riley, and a head coach in Sonny Dykes who is known to do more with less. I think these four teams fit the bill. One is from the ACC, one is from the Big 12, and two are from the Big 10. These teams are well coached. They return a lot of production. They have some high-octane players, and some, I think, are super undervalued just from a win total perspective. Before we dive into these four teams, though, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here on College Football with Sam. Liking this video also does a big help to the channel, as it helps bring us in more viewership due to pumping this video into the algorithm. YouTube loves that like button. And watching this video all the way through also helps. And lastly, comment your sleeper teams, and not just any sleeper teams, but the out of left field sleeper teams that people would call you insane for, but you know that there may be something to the fact that they could be good this year. Comment those teams down in the comment section, and we can have a conversation, because these type of teams that I'm talking about, they're out of left field, and there are more than just these four, but these are just the four that I looked at, and I thought, there's something to this. Let's start off with some absolute, what I would call insanity, at least from your perspective, and that's Georgia Tech. What is Georgia Tech doing up here? They haven't even been relevant since Paul Johnson, a pre-transfer portal and pre-NIL era college football head coach. Now, Paul Johnson was a legend in his own right. He won the ACC at Georgia Tech and also won, I think, one or perhaps more New Year's Six Bowls. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. The last time Georgia Tech played in anything that would be considered 12-team college football playoff caliber was back in 2014 when they beat a Dak Prescott-led Mississippi State team in the Orange Bowl. And they competed with and nearly beat a Jameis Winston, led Florida State team in the ACC championship game. Since then, Georgia Tech has not finished ranked. But this year could be different. Jeff Collins was an abject disaster after Paul Johnson retired. But Brent Key, from his time coaching the offensive line at Alabama and how he's rebuilt Georgia Tech's identity around being physical on the offensive side during his short tenure, I think that there is something to Brent Key, and that the staff that he has built, with Buster Faulkner as the offensive coordinator who helped develop Stetson Bennett and learned from the great Todd Monken, who was the nation's best offensive coordinator, I think, during his time at Georgia, there is something to this team being great on the offensive side of the ball. And last year, in terms of running the ball and running people over, they were one of the better teams in college football and the best in the ACC in that category. They ran for nearly 200 yards per game, 198.4 exactly, and they averaged over 5 yards per carry. And Haynes King was only sacked around 1 time per game in 13 games. Georgia Tech finished 7-6 and beat UCF in a comeback win in their bowl game. And their schedule in 2024, they kick off week 0 against Florida State. This is a really tough schedule. In a game that's in Dublin, Ireland, they play Georgia State in week 1, Syracuse in week 2, VMI in week 3, at Louisville week 4. Then they get a bye. They host Duke in week 6, play at North Carolina week 7, host Notre Dame week 8, at Virginia Tech week 9, another bye in week 10. Miami, they play in week 11, and then they have a bye after Miami, and then they host NC State and travel to rival Georgia. Now, that's a very tough schedule. It's ranked 9th per ESPN's FPI. But Florida State is a team that returns less than half of their production from last season. Many of their starters are gone. Their offensive coordinator, Alex Atkins, will be suspended. They have a lot of new incoming transfers, new faces that could take time to gel. Maybe Georgia Tech can come off with a surprise win. They can shock the world in Dublin, Ireland. Syracuse and Louisville on the road could be tough, but those teams could also be vulnerable. Syracuse has been terrible under Dino Babers, and it will take time for Fran Brown to rebuild them. Louisville loses a majority of their offense from last year. Duke is undergoing a rebuilding season. North Carolina lost Drake May. Notre Dame looks to be vulnerable on the offensive side of the ball with all the changes that are being made there, potentially. And Georgia Tech beat Miami last year, and they get a bye before that game. And NC State has some potential vulnerabilities too. The ACC is not like the Big Ten or the SEC. There is no clear hierarchy. There is a expected hierarchy of Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, but Clemson has been getting worse every single season. Florida State is replacing a lot of pieces, and it is still yet to be seen if Mario Cristobal is the guy for the Miami job. There is no Georgia. There is no Alabama. There is no Texas. There is no Ohio State, no Michigan, Oregon, Penn State. There are no current powerhouses. Again, Florida State is the closest to this, and they've only had 2 great seasons in a row. And really only 1 season where they even came close to being elite last season. And with all that they replace, it is not outer-worldly to suspect that Georgia Tech could pull something off in week 0. This team's weakness, however, they will have to dramatically improve at stopping the run if they want to compete for the playoffs, if they want to shock the entire world. On 41.1 average rushing attempts per game allowed, this defense gave up over 200 rushing yards. That has to change. Their best players, Haynes King, Jamal Haynes, Jordan Williams on the offensive line, and Eric Singleton are all on offense. The defense, particularly at the line of scrimmage, has to step up if Georgia Tech wants to have a breakout year, especially with this tough schedule. You may call me insane, but I think it can happen. This team can win in shootouts. They have the offense to be one of the best in the nation on that side of the football, particularly in the trenches and running the ball. If Haynes King cleans up his turnovers, this offense will be deadly. And if the defense even marginally improves alongside of that, this could be a top 25 team and consequentially a contender for the ACC championship, consequentially a contender for a playoff berth. Up next, we have Iowa State. Now, many of you will probably find this selection to be more realistic, and I understand why. And that's because Matt Campbell reached the Big 12 championship game in 2020, competed with Oklahoma, beat them earlier in the season, and every year there's something about Iowa State to where even though they've never reached the playoff before, and we're only close 1 year in 2020, every year in either a set of games or for the whole season, they play above their expectations. At least that's how it used to be in regards to the whole season. But even last year, they competed with Texas. They competed with Kansas. It sounds strange to say, but Lance Leipold has Kansas humming. They upset Kansas State on the road 42-35 with only 15 minutes of TOP because they got good plays, because their staff and players manufactured them. And this was a team that entering 2023, Hunter Deckers, their quarterback, was suspended due to the gambling scandal that engulfed the state of Iowa. And Rocco Becht had to start, an unproven player. And he did very well. Iowa State is at the top of college football in returning production, at the tippy top. They return 86% of their production from last year and a large portion of their roster. On top of that, Oklahoma and Texas are no longer in the Big 12. So now you have complete chaos. You have a reordering of the Big 12 hierarchy. Not entirely, because Kansas State is still going to be around. Kansas, I think, will continue to rise. Oklahoma State is close to Iowa State in terms of returning production. In fact, they may even be number one, but it's them and Iowa State and kind of everyone else. So the schedule has gotten easier, and they have a quality road non-conference win, potentially, if they can beat Iowa for the second time in the Matt Campbell era, at Iowa. North Dakota in week 1 at home, Iowa on the road in week 2, then you get a bye in week 3. Arkansas State in week 4 at home, at Houston week 5, Baylor at home week 6, at West Virginia week 7, hosting UCF week 8, a bye in week 9, hosting Texas Tech in week 10, playing at Kansas week 11, hosting Cincinnati week 12, and playing at Utah week 13, and hosting Kansas State week 14. How about week 13 and 14? That's probably when you will know who Iowa State truly is. The road game at Iowa is a rivalry game, and Iowa State struggled to beat Iowa. And outside of those last 2 games, at Utah and hosting Kansas State, maybe at Kansas in week 11, what does September and October really give you? This schedule's ranked 58th per ESPN's FPI. And with the amount of returning production that Iowa State has, I think that they have a chance to win the Big 12, or if they don't win the Big 12, have maybe a 11-1 record or some type of maybe 11-2 record. If they're going 11-1, they may not reach to the Big 12 championship game, but 95, 98, 99% of the time they will. If they beat Iowa on the road, or if there's a down year in football, there's just so many factors that you have to consider with the 12-team playoff now. It's going to be harder than ever to pick who's going to get in, because in the 4-team playoff, typically there's only anywhere from 1, 2, 3, 4, at max 5 or 6 teams every year that really can be in that elite category to end the season. Now there's a bunch of teams that can just be great, or maybe at the worst, simply good, that can sneak their way in. And this is the first year of the 12-team playoff, so we just don't know how the criteria is going to be applied. So depending on multiple things, Iowa State could not even win the Big 12 and perhaps get in. This team is fundamentally sound. They only commit about 1 turnover per game. That was last season. And they only had just under 5 penalties per game. And bringing back the amount of starters and production they do, I would not be surprised if they were one of the least penalized and most disciplined teams in all of college football. They have to improve on their run game, though, running the football. And their offensive line is to do a better job of run blocking. They ran nearly 30 times per game last year and didn't even average 4 yards per carry, which against Big 12 defenses, and I know they played Oklahoma on the road, they played Texas at home, but overall the Big 12 is a conference not known for defense, and that will probably be the case even more so now that Texas, who had one of the best rushing defenses in all of America last year, and Oklahoma, whose defense was respectable last year, are gone to the SEC. The best players for Iowa State are wide receiver Jalen Noel, linebacker Caleb Bacon, and their safeties. Iowa State is a really deep safety room and a defense that I think under John Heacock can be one of the best in 2024. They bring back field safety Jeremiah Cooper, middle safety Bro Freeler, and boundary safety Malik Verdun. Also linebacker, as I said, Caleb Bacon, and defensive end Kennard Snyder, and many other great players on the defensive side of the ball. John Heacock and Matt Campbell devised the 3-3-5 scheme at Iowa State to help limit the high-octane, explosive offenses in that conference, specifically Oklahoma's under Lincoln Riley. But with Riley gone to USC, Oklahoma and Texas leaving for the SEC, and Iowa State returning as much as they do on defense, I could see this unit being, again, one of the best, if not the best in the Big 12, and up there nationally too. And combine that with wide receivers returning like Jalen Noel and quarterback Rocco Becht, who has experience coming back, Iowa State can absolutely contend for the college football playoff in 2024. We have the Nebraska Cornhuskers up next. Now, Nebraska's win total is sitting right here, as of now, at 7.5. Georgia Tech's, keep in mind, was 4.5. Iowa State's was also 7.5, but they play in a much weaker conference and do have a weaker strength of schedule than Nebraska does. Nebraska has the 32nd ranked strength of schedule per ESPN's Football Power Index. However, Nebraska's schedule is very workable to compete for the college football playoff without winning the Big Ten. I said without there. Keep that in mind. I am in no way claiming that Nebraska can win the Big Ten this year. I don't think they can. They cannot. But what they can do is win 10 games. In week 1, they host UTEP. Then they host Colorado. Then they host Northern Iowa in week 3, Illinois in week 4. 4 straight home games. They play at Purdue in week 5, host Rutgers in week 6, then have a bye in week 7. They could be easily 6-0 entering that bye. Off the bye, they play at Indiana in week 8. They could be 7-0 entering that game against Ohio State in week 9 on the road. That's likely an auto loss, similar with Georgia Tech playing on the road at Georgia. In week 10, they host UCLA. They have a bye in week 11. They travel at USC in week 12, host Wisconsin week 13, travel to Iowa for the Heroes Trophy in week 14. And that will be a night game, which I think is awesome. It's one of the awesome new developments of the new era of college football. There are plenty of traditions being kept, but also many traditions are being adjusted. They're being fine-tuned. And I think this is great, at least in that aspect of the Heroes game and also the game with Michigan and Ohio State, but that's a topic for another day. There are both pros and cons to this new era of college football. A pro for Nebraska is you don't have to win the Big Ten to reach the college football playoff. A 10-2 Nebraska, if there are several teams with 11 wins, 10 wins, or many undefeated teams, with this schedule, even 10-2 may not be good enough to reach the playoff. But if there's a down year in football in terms of not overall quality of teams, but there are several upsets, 10-2 with this schedule will probably get you in, or at least in the conversation. And once in the playoff, and this is the case with all the teams we've talked about, if the matchup is favorable, Nebraska absolutely has the roster cohesion and talent at specific positions to engage in a close game and win said close game in the playoff. The strength of this team is overall their defense, but let's zoom in on their rushing defense. Nebraska was top 20 in most statistical categories last year, including points per play allowed and points allowed per game. They were top 10 in run defense. They faced 31.3 opponent rush attempts per game last year, and they only gave up 92.3 yards per game. Roughly translates to they only allowed around 3 yards per carry on the ground. And this is even factoring Michigan into account. I know they played Colorado, they played Minnesota before Darius Taylor came on the scenes, and Iowa did not have a good run offense or good offense period, but they played, whether it was Michigan or Wisconsin, some teams that did have capable rushing offenses, and they did a respectable job against those teams. The weakness of this team overall is offensive efficiency. and Glenn Thomas was brought in as a co-offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach to reassign some roles that Marcus Satterfield had last season. And with Dylan Raiola starting as a true freshman and being as talented as he is, fixing the quarterback position would do a world of wonders for Nebraska in terms of efficiency. They only scored 0.281 points per play, which is pathetic. That was outside the top 100 last year, and that was exclusively for offense. Their points per play margin was close to zero, about breaking even. And they gave up 2.6 turnovers per game last season, the Cornhuskers did. That is, I know, that's some Scott Frost level stuff right there. And Nebraska, much like Georgia Tech, has not been relevant in a long time. It sucks when you came from the Big 12 and you're a blue blood, and yet Iowa State with absolutely no recruiting prowess has been more relevant than you have. But I think that may end this year. I think Nebraska will be a great team. Like all the teams that I'm talking about in this video, I think that they are likely to be undervalued in their win total, and I'm actually predicting all of these teams to surpass their win total and hit the over this season. Emmett Johnson's a good running back. I think Raiola will be a good quarterback. Nash Hutmacher is one of the nation's better defensive tackles. Strong safety Isaac Gifford and cornerback Tommy Hill are among some other great players and some of Nebraska's best. Also, watch out for their offensive tackle duo. They gave up a ton of sacks last year in part due to injuries and incompetency at the QB position. But if Raiola's pocket presence that he showed in high school and the spring game carry through to the regular season, and Nebraska's O-line's further developed and healthier, they do have an underrated offensive line and an underrated offensive tackle group. Very large, very long, and I'm just saying, it sounds insane, just like Georgia Tech, but Nebraska could be one of those out-of-left-field teams that competes for a college football playoff spot, and depending, again, strongly, I say, depending on the seeding, perhaps a big upset win. Again, we're going for the unthinkable here. So even though I said in my college football playoff review of Nebraska, talking about whether they could reach the playoff and win a game, I said I highly doubt, if not, I said they can't win a college football playoff game. With the size of the 12-team playoff and also the fact that upsets happen, things happen that you think are impossible. In this video, this is all about the impossible becoming the possible. And that would be Rutgers making the playoff. How insane would that be? Well, their schedule's the easiest out of all the teams on this list. Who would have thought that? Rutgers having an easier schedule than Iowa State, Georgia Tech, and Nebraska. But come on, they play in the Big Ten East. No, they don't, because the Big Ten East doesn't exist anymore. And their only permanent rival is Maryland. They don't play Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan. The best team from the former Big Ten East that they play could be Michigan State. It could be Maryland. And newsflash, I don't think those are going to be top 25 teams this year. They don't play Oregon either. The schedule for Rutgers is perfect to reach 10 or, because of how weak the schedule is, likely the 11 wins necessary to reach the college football playoff. To have a guaranteed seat at the table is what I'm talking about. 10-2, again, if there are plenty of upsets among other teams and Rutgers is just churning away and at least one of their wins is a top 25 team, 10-2 could get them a lower seed easily. They open up in week 1 against Howard. Then in week 2, they host Akron. They get a bye before traveling on the road to a tough Virginia Tech team. They return to host Washington to open up Big Ten Conference play in week 5, play at Nebraska week 6, host Wisconsin week 7, host UCLA week 8, travel at USC in week 9. They get a bye in week 10 before hosting Minnesota in week 11, playing at Maryland week 12, hosting Illinois week 13, and playing at Michigan State. Caught myself there in week 14. Rutgers' win total with this schedule is 6.5. Now, I think that's insanity, even if Rutgers isn't going to be a top 25 team, and I think they will be, but even if they aren't, They went 6-6 last year with a gauntlet of a schedule. They bring back almost 3/4 of their production from last year with a much easier schedule compared to 2023. How are they being viewed as a 6-6, 7-5 football team? I don't get it. Part of me, though, understands that with how bad their offense was last year overall, I mean, just look at these passing game numbers, they're jarring. They had 10.7 completions per game. They didn't even complete 50% of their passes on the season, and they only averaged 5.9 passing yards per attempt and less than 10 yards per passing completion. Those are sad numbers, and that's why Gavin Wimsatt left for Kentucky. But we don't even know if Ethan Kaliakmanis will produce better numbers than that. So the passing offense has to improve at least somewhat, unless you're going to rely on the rushing attack going from an above average to good unit to being one of the best in the country, which with this schedule, they may look like one of the best in the country, whether they are or not, because Kyle Monangai is one of the best running backs in the country. The pass defense of this team is a strength, and if the run defense improves, this secondary, the linebacker core, could be recognized for what it is, one of the best in the Big Ten and nationally. They only allowed 189.1 passing yards per game last year, and they only allowed 6.2 passing yards per attempt. Along with Monangai, you have offensive guard Brian Thelter, who, along with just an offensive line that I think returns 3 or 4 starters and just was really good at pass protection, even though everything else in the passing offense was bad, and they were good enough at run blocking to make this offense competent. They returned Gus Zielinskis at center, at tackle. Hullen Pierce is going to be great. And Muhammad Toure and Tyreen Powell, solid linebackers. And by solid linebackers, I mean tough, I mean gritty, and they make up one of the best linebacker duos in the country. And look out for Robert Longerbeam at corner and Flip Dixon at safety as well. Those are Rutgers' best players right there. And with a schedule that they have and a roster that is cohesive, and remember, like all the coaches we've talked about, Brent Key, Matt Campbell, Matt Rule. Strange that out of these 4 teams, 2 of these head coaches had the first name of Matt. And also, Greg Schiano. I think they're all... There's something to them all and the programs they're building. And I think this is especially the case, not just when you look at recruiting and how they identify talent. Campbell's done a great job of that at Iowa State, recruiting players who fit his scheme, his system, his program's identity. Matt Rule has done well on the recruiting trail. Greg Schiano has done a great job on the recruiting trail. And Brent Key recruited well at Alabama, and I think he's doing a good job at Georgia Tech, given Georgia Tech's expectations and academic restrictions. When you look at the developmentals, the ability to create good players that these coaches have, their resumes, I think that's where they're the most impressive. And especially with Greg Schiano rebuilding Rutgers slowly his second time around, that's very impressive. So those are my 4 teams that I think can reach the college football playoff, perhaps have their first win in college football playoff in their school history is what I mean, pardon me, and overachieve on their win total. These teams, I think, could be the 2022 TCUs of the 2024 season. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and also comment your thoughts on this video down in the comments below. Thank you to my Patreon members for sponsoring this channel and video. I want to give a shout out to Crash2488 and Nebraska Rascal, my Heisman members, Chris Lane, Connor Little OH, and Ismar, my All-American members, and John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell, my All-Conference members. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all very soon. Also, don't forget to check out my merchandise store along with my Patreon page via the links in the description and down below in the pinned comment. My merchandise is very comfortable, and if you're a fan of a Big Ten program, you can represent your school and this channel by getting a College Football with Sam themed t-shirt that is colored in with all 18 Big Ten school colors. Whether it's a Rutgers t-shirt, Nebraska t-shirt, or any other Big Ten themed t-shirt, you can find it on my merchandise store. See you guys soon, and thanks for watching.